Hello, Cherries fans. Welcome back to another edition of Sparky'S Stats. But today the stats are going well out the window. I have not one for you. Instead, I'm going to be going back to my armchair manager place, bringing out the tactics board, and having a look at Iraola's pressing. Where has it gone right so far? Why did it go right? And why are we struggling in so many situations, particularly against Arsenal? And I suppose the best way to start will be with a little bit of an explainer, I guess. At its very basics, when Bournemouth in the red are playing in a 4-2-3-1 against any, or at least a large number of Premier League opposition that play 4-3-3, which is a relatively popular formation in the league now, this is the kind of situation that you would expect when we are looking to initiate some kind of press from the goalkeeper having the ball. Now, this is just a basic look. This isn't how Iraola does it, but this is where you can hopefully visualize the basics of it. Throughout the entire middle of the pitch, we have man-for-man marking. And on both wings, we have man-for-man marking. Everyone very clearly has a man, and they stick to that person, okay? But then when dealing with a solo striker, you're going to want to have that little bit of an overload to make sure that both centre-backs are keeping an eye on the one striker, because that's your most vulnerable position. It's where you are closest to your own goal. And generally what you're going to have is one very aggressive centre-back that really pushes up to the striker. In our case, it's Zabarnyi, who's been very effective at that 1v1 aerial duel in the middle of the pitch. If he doesn't win it, he makes it very difficult, and you have someone, if it's Kelly, you have his physical attributes, he can sweep up or he can run beyond if the ball gets flicked on, and then, or if it's Senesi, who can be aggressive in his own way, he can also mop up in those situations. But the important thing here is if you're going to have a 2v1 somewhere, you're going to have a 1v2 elsewhere, and that's obviously you're going to want that as far away from your own pitch, from your own goal, as possible. So in this case, looking at generally, your striker is going to have to worry about which centre-back he sits on, because he's not going to be able to pick up both of them. And this is sort of like the starting point, which to then generate pressing ideas from and go, okay, if this is my basic situation and I'm always going to be down a man in the pressing moments, how can I make it so that the ball ends up in a situation and my players end up in a situation where this disadvantage no longer matters, and I can force the opposition to play it long or play a difficult pass or just straight up lose the ball and allow us to create a really easy attacking opportunity. Now, where has Bournemouth's press gone really well so far this season? This is the setup we had against Brighton. And for those of you that join me on my watch along or look towards the end of the watch along, I think I also did it in the middle of in half time as well. I showed up this scenario. I'm going to be using these dark blue colors for every opposition team, so I'm not varying that up at all. But here, Brighton were playing in a 4-4-2, and it allowed us to press in a 4-4-2 because once again, everyone had their own man. You had your two centre-backs going up against two strikers, wingers and full-backs up against each other, central midfielders, and you had your two attackers going up against two centre-backs. What would very often happen is a lot of these players would move about the pitch. Buonanotte from the right-hand side sometimes ended up right in the middle of the pitch, and Kirkes would follow him. Or a lot of the time, the out ball that Brighton wanted to play was a pass straight through the middle of the pitch, Ferguson to drop deep and pick the ball up. But Zabarnyi followed him everywhere. And Ferguson only played one half because he was absolutely dominated by Zabarnyi. Didn't really get a sniff at all against him. And it was a very effective system, but it was easy to implement. It's good old-fashioned man marking. Every man only has to worry about one person. Well, apart from one player. You've still got to attack the goalkeeper. So how do you do that? Very simple. Ryan Christie, in this instance, is the one that takes up a position where he is now sort of marking more than one man, as it were. He makes sure that the goalkeeper for Bruggen cannot pass to Webster easily, constantly being in the way, somewhere in the middle, making sure that any opportunity has to go, any pass has to go to a man that is marked because everyone is. And Webster is the impossible pass. So Christie just keeps making sure that no matter where Webster moves to, if Webster is a bit more forward, then Christie's a bit more forward. If Webster drops deeper, Christie goes a bit deeper. He just makes sure he's in the way. And eventually their opportunity becomes where Bruggen sort of stumbles a little bit, doesn't play the right pass. Christie wins it, so Solanke gets in, and we score a goal. Worked incredibly well. Not going to dwell on the second half. We're kind of going to cover that in a second. Now let's move on to versus Chelsea. This is where I can show you a little bit more of the ideas of what Iraola wants in his press to create situations where you can force that a disadvantage into a different area of the pitch where you can then be a lot more aggressive when the ball is in a position you want it to be in. So here we have a position that you would find relatively frequently against a few times against Chelsea. The goalkeeper Sanchez passes the ball out to the free centre-back on the left-hand side. And here, this is where the press is instigated. Christie, who's on the DM, now should be pushing towards the left centre-back. Billing then leaves his man to come over to the defensive midfielder that Christie has left. And if that is actioned correctly, rather than the 1v2 happening around the centre backs, the 1v2 in the end actually happens for the left mid, who in this case is Ouattara. He now has two players that he needs to focus on, but we are looking to apply as much pressure to the player on the ball. If the ball goes back to the goalkeeper, it's not really the end of the world, but ideally we'd make this as difficult as we can for him to play the pass that he wants to, wherever that may be. So Christie needs to be effective in his press. Billing needs to be effective in making sure that he's pressing Ugochukwu. The worry, or the frustration in the end for us rather, was Ouattara wasn't picking the right man to then move on to. In this situation, where do you want the ball to end up? If the ball has to go to one of these two players, where do you not want it to go? Well, you don't want it to be going towards your own goal. So this is the danger man. And this is where, if the rest of the press is being done correctly, Iraola wants his fullback to pull onto the central midfielder and make sure that this is not available. The least dangerous player for Iraola is going to be the fullback on the opposite side. He is essentially the furthest from goal at this point. So, at this point, Ouattara should come on to Gallagher as it is. Instead, Ouattara does not do that. He sticks far too often to Malagusto. And it is far too easy because Christie's press wasn't as effective as it should be for, it's frustrating. The name is just blanking me for some reason. It's Chelsea's 38-year-old at this point, centre-back, to receive the ball and play it long to Gallagher, who is in an absolute bucket load of space. And how many times do we all remember seeing in that Chelsea game Gallagher just picking up the ball almost on the edge of our half with no one around him? Because the important part of the press was not the sort of like last part of the press, which relies on your midfielder making the right decision and pushing onto the central midfielder, wasn't happening. And you might say, like, okay, well, if this is always working, why isn't he always doing that job? It's like, well, if this initial first part of the press isn't successful, if Billing doesn't necessarily make the right run, or if he's maybe holding a middle ground between the two, then Ouattara should stick a lot more to the fullback. But Christie wasn't necessarily making the right pressing. Billing was often a little bit late with his press, and Ouattara just doesn't seem to have it in him to make the right call a lot of the time. Admittedly, I think in the second half this happened less, but certainly in the first half I remember this being an incredible frustration for me. But here's something I do want to just mention here. I'm going to draw around these players. In this situation, how bad is the outnumbering, as it were. We've got 6 of our attackers versus 7 opposition. 6 of our pressers versus 7 opposition attackers. They're the centre backs and central midfielders, but the defenders and the central midfielders. But they're the attackers in this situation. They have the ball. Okay. However, what happens, as is the case versus Arsenal, where the goalkeeper operates as a centre back, as Raya did frequently, and is so capable on the ball that was pulling himself into positions that made it incredibly difficult for us. We now have an even worse outnumbering position. It's now 6v8. You now can't have one player that's meant to sort of shift between two. You now have 2 players that have to shift between 2 players. They have to be the hybrid presser. They have to pick which man they need to mark in each situation. And you need to have a strong level of discipline and a strong tactical awareness to be able to deal with those situations. Now, bear in mind, when I just showed you this Chelsea spot, and we had Christie wasn't necessarily doing his job well enough, Billing wasn't necessarily doing his job well enough, and Ouattara wasn't doing his job well enough, you've got at least 3 players that aren't able to do the basic level of this role. You only need one of them to fail for things to break down. And we had 3 early in the sort of the first half an hour against Chelsea. Things very much improved. I think we'll all remember that sort of like towards the second quarter, as it were, Bournemouth got a lot more involved in the game against Chelsea. But there were very clear deficiencies for the first sort of like 20, 25 minutes. And this was how it was. Players were not doing their jobs properly. This now is against Arsenal. And what we have here is 2 things. Firstly, Solanke is now looking after 2 players. You've got the right back Benjamin White and you've got Saliba. And here you've got Tavernier that's kind of keeping in between the centre back, the left centre back Gabriel, and the goalkeeper in Raya. And the second thing to point out is the biggest difficulty and one of the biggest tactical innovations of the last sort of like season and a bit is the box midfield. What you may have heard spoken about is a 3-box-3, or in this case, because the goalkeeper is essentially a centre back, you could call this a 4-box-3. But it's essentially so that in this case it's Zinchenko, but it could be the right back, as it was with I feel as though Kyle Walker has done this at times for Man City. One of the defenders comes into this position, and John Stones has done it obviously a lot towards the end of last season when things were going really well for City, is that one of the defenders becomes a central midfielder, and you have 2 attacking midfielders and 2 defensive midfielders forming what is never going to be overwhelmed. 4 players right in the middle of the pitch are almost always going to have a numerical superiority. And what Bournemouth started with against Arsenal was at least a way to ensure that they did not have that numerical superiority. Kluivert was the one that was coming off from the left-hand side and sticking to Declan Rice. You had Billing pushing up against Zinchenko, Christie was up against Havertz, and Cook was up against Ødegaard. The difficulty being in this situation that Solanke was actually doing what I introduced as a principle, doing the right thing in terms of what I introduced as a principle in the previous example, is that the player that you are happy to have the ball is the fullback on the opposite side. Generally, it's normally what you're looking for, is the fullback on the opposite side of where the ball is to get the ball and be the freest man. So Solanke would be pushing on to Saliba to make the shorter pass more difficult. Unfortunately, you are dealing with someone that's pretty darn good on the ball. And Raya, within, I think this was the 3rd minute, I think this example is from 3rd or 4th minute, just plays ball in behind to Benjamin White, who's in acres of space on this side, because Saka is a player that you've got to really pay strong attention to, as Kirk is sticking to his man. Kluivert then has to make a recovery run to jump backwards. But while Bournemouth had initial pressure in the first 2 minutes, this is maybe the first instance that Bournemouth are trying to press Arsenal high up the pitch, and it's broken pretty darn easily. moving on to the next example, this is the big one that a lot of people, and I certainly focused on just after the 5-minute mark. Cliver has initially got a little bit worried the fact that Ben White is ending up in so much space on his own after that ball over the top. So he's now quite concerned about Ben White and is taking up this position, sort of focused on him, but kind of on Ødegaard. Whereas actually in the previous example, Rice was his man who has come onto the left-hand side. So now Cliver isn't sticking to the player that he should do and is playing a little bit wider. You've then got a Tavernier who's still sticking somewhat to Gabriel on the left-hand side. Solanke is still doing his job of worrying about his two men in White and Saliba. But Billing is now stuck with Rice, who he wasn't with before, and is focused more on Rice than he is on Zinchenko, who is actually his man. And because Christian Havertz is still a 1v1 situation here and Cliver isn't sticking to his man, what we now have is this box again of the four midfielders of Arsenal that I was talking about. But because we've lost Cliver involved in this, we're at a disadvantage again. You have someone here that's looking after two players that can't. Not that Billing is incapable of it, it's just that in this situation, there's no way he can mark both players. And with Raya on the ball, it is an incredibly simple pass through here to Zinchenko, who runs on to receive the ball. And if you find a shot on Twitter of this, within a split second of Raya playing the ball through to Zinchenko, Ødegaard has already moved and completely lost Cook. So within 2 seconds, we now have this situation. And I'll draw another box here, but you'll notice within 2 seconds, look at this situation here. Count the blue players, count the red players. From one pass from the goalkeeper, we are outnumbered on our own, well, which is soon to be in our own half. We're going to be outnumbered. 6 Arsenal players, 5 Bournemouth players. From one pass where a press is just completely ineffective. That's worrying. But what I do want to just, put across again here is that Bournemouth players at the moment do not look like they're really fully capable of being continually switched on for Iraola's basic plan, where he is not dealing with a goalkeeper that is making those kinds of passes. I have completely I've wiped the second half of Brighton from my memory. I don't really remember it, but I can imagine this situation that I just described against Arsenal, where players are not able to stick to their men enough because the goalkeeper is so heavily involved with play that you are essentially doubly outnumbered, as in you're outnumbered 6-8 in the press as opposed to 6-7. This happened against Arsenal, and I'm fairly certain it will have happened against Brighton, which is why we were so ineffective in pressing and really getting anything done in the second half against them. Basically, what I'm just looking to say is that I think I don't have any solutions. I'm an armchair manager. I'm a complete amateur at this. I've done a couple minutes of research. I haven't built a career on this. But I do think that Bournemouth players at the moment don't look like they're necessarily able to initiate Iraola's press. Certainly not for 90 minutes. Against Chelsea, it probably worked for maybe 45 to 60 minutes, but for the first 30, it was terrible. Against Arsenal, it was completely ineffective. Brighton's system allowed us to play very well against them in that 4-4-2 situation in the first half. But what I hope is that against Everton, who are not going to be playing the ball around as fancily at the back, we can create the situations that Iraola wants to create. And I'm hoping that what he does, particularly as Ouattara obviously only has started against Chelsea and he hasn't played again. And I feel as though Tavernier has struggled a little bit with this, is that the wingers that have to do that hybrid job where they have to be focusing on the fullback and focusing on the central midfielder and know when to go to which man, because that's basically the most important part of the press, that over time, and I say over time, it's been long enough, but in the space of another few weeks, we've got an international break, which will pull a few people away, but We've got this game against Everton. It doesn't have to be perfect against Everton. It just has to work in certain situations, and we just need to be more dominant on the ball, and we need to show what we can do in open play. The thing that the other area that makes me sort of wonder about why Iraola is being so insistent on this high press is, I think, is he not capable of just initiating a mid block, picking up the ball a bit deeper, and then actually getting us to produce open play chances, which, we've scored 5 goals. 2 of those were from a high press, maybe 3, certainly Brighton's and Liverpool's. West Ham's with maybe a little bit of luck, but that was a bit more open play. That was some good build-up through Semenyo and others. I want to see more imagination from the attackers when we just have the ball in our own half. How do we get forward with the ball? How can we beat our opponent's press and not have to worry so much about being so perfect at our own press of the opposition? Anyway, I'm sorry to disappoint you that I don't really have any solutions here. This was more of a show of why things went wrong and the areas that it went wrong in particular, in some specific examples. There's far too much to go into, particularly with the Arsenal game. But for the Chelsea one, that's the main one where I go, does this team, can the current players that we have actually implement Iraola's press effectively for the majority of the game? And I have my concerns. In time, with players coming back, Tyler Adams notwithstanding, but the likes of Alex Scott, who's hopefully only a couple of weeks away, can we start to do more with this? Can we be more effective? And can we implement or impose ourselves on our opposition a lot more than we currently have? But that would be a discussion for a separate video, I feel. And I think we need to see how we do against Wolves, Everton, and Burnley first. Not in that order. But that'll be it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit the like and subscribe if you did. Stick around for more of this content every few weeks to every month. We'll see how frequently I get it done. And our weekly Cherries in Focus show, which you can catch up on in playlists on the channel. But hit the bell if you want to stay notified. And other than that, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Up the cherries.